The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
And welcome to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station. And I'm Ben Ball, pastor at the Broad Creek United Methodist Church, along with the Reverend Robert Cornegie, associate pastor at Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle, and also Reverend Carl Zorowski, who's pastored at St. Peter's United Methodist Church in Morehead City. And good day, gentlemen.
Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, Ben. As we are recording this today, we are just about 36 hours out from the Las Vegas shooting that has, as of this morning, left 59 dead and over 500 injured, and trying to still learn more about what was going on. Any potential understanding of motive, which none of that has been revealed yet, and there's still so much of the examination left. But what is true is that certainly people, Robert, are scarred by the event. I mean, and we're not just the victims and those who were there and the witnesses who will forever have that in their heads, but also those of us who are often have to deal with tragedy, often on a personal level, but even on a large scale, nothing like this maybe since 9/11, but a scale that makes it very difficult to talk to our congregations or to people who are upset by it. So that's what we want to start with today, and that's a hard thing. But Robert, I know you've been looking into some of the verses, some of the things that we can do and where we might go in this conversation.
I mean, it is. This is such a tragedy, and it's sadly. I mean, obviously, you run the statistics on these kind of things, and it's something that is frequently, not to this degree perhaps, but it occurs frequently, and so we as pastors deal with crises and tragedies in individual lives in our congregation and in our communities fairly regularly too. And so we are the ones that often people look to. And of course, we're in that stage right now where the comfort of the Lord in comforting those that have lost loved ones in their friends or family or the circumstances, or have loved ones that are in the hospital and are hopefully they're stabilized and they're starting to get better. But there is that sense of that ministry of presence that we begin with, and we saw that happening. Even in the middle of the tragedy, that as people were falling wounded, people were gathering around them and they wouldn't leave. Mm-hmm. I mean, they told the others with them, "You go, I'm going to stay." And there was one story of a gentleman who stayed with his friend and who had been shot 3 times, and how he had that ministry of presence. So that's a powerful one right there. That courage that it takes to be able to do that. And that sort of self-awareness of what is going on around you, and how many of there have been stories that have come out of some of those that died in this attack that had shielded others with their bodies in the process. One seminary graduate that was protecting his wife and was killed in the process of doing that. And so that brings out, that brings that other side that, we look at everyone says why, and it brings up those questions about the problem of evil. Mm-hmm. Why does a good God allow evil to exist? And we're told, I mean, the 66 books of what we call the Bible, the Old Testament, New Testament, deal with this very directly. And in the Psalms and in throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are some powerful scriptures that specifically address it. And the President Trump picked one of the great ones to be able to speak to that. And it was a great moment when he said, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." And so many of us are. I'm sure you feel the same way.
Yeah, I
kind
think
of
we all do.
crushed
Yeah.
in spirit. I mean, we weren't there, we weren't in it, but it happened on our watch and in our nation. And so, as Americans, that's a.
Carl, I think for a lot of us, and especially those who are in the pulpits, but a lot of us, whenever a tragedy strikes, we know that there are people who are going to be reminded of the tragedies that have happened in their own lives. People that have died too soon, people that have been met with tragic ends, and they're going. It doesn't matter the circumstances of what precipitated this event; they're going to be reminded of that, and all counseling that you may have done, all the things that have happened in between time, even the love they've experienced from other people, is somewhat reopening the wound.
Yes, and I think as pastors, we need to be prepared for some of those people to come forward and talk to us again. Mm-hmm. I think about some situations that I have had to minister to people who face just horribly tragic situations, where the question was, why did this happen? And I'm supposed to have the answers, and obviously I don't have the answers. But what I could share with them was a message of hope. I talk about how when the disciples are in the boat and the storm is about to destroy the boat and they're all about to drown, and they wake up Jesus who's asleep in the back of the boat, and he brings a calmness over everything. And that when we're facing situations like this, we need to remember that Jesus is there. He's there with us. The storms are going to happen. And when things like this hit us, we might feel like the boat is about to fill up with water and we're all about to be destroyed. But he is there. And we just need to turn to him. And, as the president quoted, where he said, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit." I think too often when tragedy strikes, we try to face it on our own and feel like this is our problem. We've got to fix it. And we don't realize it's beyond our fixing. This situation is beyond our fixing. Okay, you can come up with new laws, new regulations. This is beyond those being able to fix that. This is a time when we are really reminded that we need to turn to a higher power.
That evil does exist in the world.
Evil does exist. We've seen that since, the story of Cain and Abel. Did Cain use a gun to kill Abel? Mm-hmm. No. And I know that our topic this morning is not about gun control. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about something horrible happened where somebody made a decision to harm another human being. Mm. And that goes all the way back to that first murder in the Bible. We don't know how Cain killed Abel, but we know that he did. And it was a choice that he made. And that's what happened here. Somebody made a choice, and their choice led to this massacre of human life.
It's tragedy, yeah.
And we have to recognize sometimes how close we are to that, that we're, as fallen individuals, as fallen people, is that if we don't reconcile ourselves with that and come in repentance for our own sins, then we are close to making a bad decision.
Yeah, it's interesting. The article that we're talking about brings up 4 basic scriptures that address some of the questions that pop up in this always arise in these kind of situations. And of course that the Psalm 34 one is a powerful one, and in that God is present even in those times when we don't feel his presence, that he is present. And that's a truth that is, our experience may be different than the truth, but what do we believe is the truth? Do we believe our feelings about it, or do we believe the promise that God said he would never forsake us. He'd never leave us. He'd always be with us.
It doesn't necessarily mean you're getting all the answers that you
No,
want
not at all.
here.
No.
But the mere presence of the Lord, there is a comfort, there's a shelter in that for our hearts and minds. And another one, John 16:33, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble or tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So what is that saying? Look, evil exists in this world, and it will exist as long as
until Christ returns.
until
Yes,
the
right,
return
right.
of Christ. And so it's a yet. It exists for this period of time. And the purpose, we're not really sure of all the purposes, but we've seen God use incredibly terrible situations that he, in his sovereignty, permits it to happen. And he is able to turn that into a blessing somehow. It's when you're in the battle of it, it's hard to know that God can actually bring about a good out of something that's terrible.
And our quest here is how do we answer the call to serve God through all this? We'll have more to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240, and I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Carl Zarowski and Reverend Robert Cornegie. We were talking in our last segment about the very, very difficult subject of talking about the Las Vegas shooting, and we are still faced with other difficult subjects as well. This is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, and there's an article in the Christianity Today about 1 in 3 Protestant churchgoers personally affected by suicide. And it is a difficult subject, but we don't want to ignore it. Let's go ahead and face it here. Suicide remains a taboo subject in many Protestant churches, despite the best efforts of pastors, according to a new study from Lifeway Research. 8 in 10 Protestant senior pastors believe their church is equipped to intervene with someone who is threatening suicide. Yet few people turn to the church for help before taking their own lives. According to church-going friends and family, only 4% of churchgoers who have lost a close friend or family member to suicide say church leaders were aware of their loved one's struggles. I think right there presents the paradox to talk about here. Carl, this is the assumption that churches are prepared to intervene. Well, intervention is very different from perhaps counseling, and making a phone call when somebody says that might be what they're defining as intervening, but it may not be nearly enough. But
I've as a pastor, I've got those phone numbers, and I can call, and push it off to somebody else. But when it's somebody that comes to me as their pastor, and they are really, really struggling. I dealt with this probably, I'll just say I've dealt with this in the past. And, when you're sitting there with the individual and they start saying, I've got all these things, I'm weighing them out. Here's the good, here's the bad. And you sit there and you say, wow, I understand why this person is feeling this way. Okay. And then you realize that you may be their last hope at this point in time. Because even if you contact somebody, if you leave that person, something may happen. Okay. And
you could just leave the room.
If you just leave the room, yes. And, and you start talking to them about, well, what do you have here in your home that could be harmful, and it could be something as simple as a table knife. Okay. But I don't know that I have ever felt as helpless as a pastor as I did in that type of a situation. But do I feel equipped to deal with suicide and people threatening? I feel like I might be more equipped than some people, but do I feel like I have all the answers? No, I do not.
You know, Robert, this is it's such a difficult subject because and I'm not going to blame all of society and culture here, but the way we are now, though, we have devalued life, and we've also desensitized violence, and so it seems that it may be so simple for someone to make that permanent solution to a temporary problem, make that decision in a heartbeat.
Yeah, every time this subject comes up, I have to admit I am such a creature of media.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a movie when I was in college that came out, and it's been on TV ever since, and it was called MASH.
And MASH, oh yeah,
MASH.
right.
Okay.
The theme song.
Remember the?
Yeah, suicide is painless.
I mean, this and that. I honestly that little. It brings on many changes, you know.
Sung by Loudon Wainwright.
Yeah, and that tape starts playing, and the way they, in my understanding, the way they presented suicide as a reasonable option.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, the circumstance of this thing was different, but you know, and so as a society, you mentioned society, and so I just want to say, you know, that's kind of ingrained in people kind of from our era who were in the formative stages when, you know, in thinking of maybe these thoughts that we'd never really considered some of these issues and that kind of thing and the impact of that. So society does influence the way we look at these things. Now, as a Christian and as a pastor, I find myself having another way of talking about this issue, but it is one of the most difficult ones. And Carl, I appreciate your honesty on that, because, you know, it's fascinating from the article that how many churches think they really have it together. I mean, there is this perception within the congregations and within the church, at large, and even some of the pastors that we've got the protocol. Mm-hmm. You know, the suicide protocol. We know who to call. You know, all that kind of stuff. And
that's
frankly,
not the same.
Not the same. No. But it does, interestingly. We don't know the motives behind what happened in Las Vegas. If this was a suicide by cop situation, we just don't know. You know, that's become a new phenomena. Is that people, you know, they'll
get somebody else to
do it for them.
But the whole idea then is you going back to mention Las Vegas, that you mentioned in the last segment, is that ministry of presence is still maybe I don't think there's a maybe. That is the most powerful thing that we have to offer for someone. As someone who told me early on when I was starting to teach Sunday school or be a lay speaker before I answered a call to ministry, I was feeling very angst about this. You know, being in a position where I might be called on to counsel, and she had been directly affected by suicide, and she said, "You're just being there may provide the help that's needed." Because
sounding board.
Because if the person has it convinced, they can very calmly go about it, and you'll never know that they're going to do that.
That's right.
So she was trying to say, don't be so hard on yourself about it,
right.
but still don't run away.
Mm-hmm.
Be there for somebody.
Yeah. And I don't think people who consider suicide, I don't think that they realize how selfish an act it is. Because once they do this, are their problems over? Well, that's how they view it, okay? But they do so much damage to those around them. And think about this. Think about how much your mother loved you. Mm-hmm. If you were to commit suicide, what would that do to your mother? It would destroy her. Do you know who loves you more than your mother? Your Creator. Mm-hmm. So imagine what it does to God's heart when you destroy the life that He gave to you.
Yeah. I think in the counseling situations that I've been in as a Christian and as a pastor, it's often brought up as an option. They're kind of working through they're in a stressful crisis situation, and they just don't. They're losing the options, and so all of a sudden, this one comes up. This is kind of the last option in the list. And so I think for me, and as a counselor and pastor, and you guys maybe can speak to this as well, you don't like to get to that last option. No. In fact, what I tend to do is say, well, let's explore kind of like the consequences, what you're talking about. Is this just something that affects you? Does it affect others? Let's walk through that process. And are there other coping mechanisms for the crisis you're in right now? Yeah. And often drugs and other things they've gone through all of those. They're not working anymore, and they're coming to that last resort, if you will. And so trying to talk them back from that is, part of the challenge.
Yeah. And again, the challenge is recognizing when is this a assertive cry for help, where if you will talk about the things that led to that point, then they can start to see some light at the end of the tunnel. Or when is it a real plea that this is going to be imminent unless you intervene.
Right.
This is a very difficult thing. Again, some may plot for a long period of time. Some it may be a spur of the moment decision.
Right, and I have to recognize as a pastor that there are those who are better at discerning where that person is than I am.
Yeah,
okay?
Exactly.
I can't be Superman as a pastor. I have to know what my limits are.
Right.
Okay.
That's a very good point.
And unfortunately, sometimes we're not faced with our limits until we're there in that living room with somebody at the end of their rope saying, I'm getting ready to kill myself. And you go, oh, what do I say?
Look.
What do I say? But what you do is you stay and you talk with that person, and you do what you can, and you rely on God a lot.
Well, in our ministry to the ill and infirmed in the hospital, I've had this come up, and they're just saying, I can't take it anymore. I just
and what's the answer?
Can't take it anymore. And so they have come up to that edge, and how do we get them back from the edge, and walk through that process and look at some of the it's so tough. And prayer absolutely is the
intentional prayer.
And follow up and check on that person.
Right.
Don't just leave there and assume everything's going to be fine.
Yeah.
You check on that person.
Yeah.
And and if necessary, get them the help they need.
More to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back here to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Carl Zarowski and Reverend Robert Cornegie. And this is the week when the Supreme Court starts again. The first week in October is always their opening session, and they've put out some of the list of cases they'll be considering. One of those that we'll be considering and mostly watched case, this comes from a Fox News article. It says, with the Supreme Court starting its 2017 term on the first Monday in October, we'll soon be getting a good idea of how the Trump court with President's pick Neil Gorsuch operates. And one of the most closely watched cases this term will be Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission. Two of the most precious rights Americans possess are the rights to express themselves freely and the right to practice their religion as they see fit. both enshrined in the First Amendment. But these rights are not absolute, and sometimes they may clash with the duty towards others, and Masterpiece Cake Shop is a case that will test these limits. It started in July 2012, and Charlie Craig and David Mullins asked Jack Phillips, who owned the Masterpiece Cake Shop, to create a custom wedding cake to celebrate their same-sex marriage. Phillips refused, saying they didn't want to promote a same-sex wedding due to his religious beliefs. And this went again before the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, and that's where this case has churned its way up to the Supreme Court. We also have in Mississippi, this is a ruling by the Federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that upheld what's called HB 1523, and it refused a rehearing by a full court on a lawsuit attempting to block State House Bill 1523, a religious objections bill that opponents say codifies discrimination against LGBT people. The bill, supporters say, protects people who act on their beliefs that marriage between one man and one woman, that sexual relations are properly confined to such a marriage, and that male and female refers to an individual's biological sex at birth. It was passed in reaction to the Supreme Court ruling that legalized gay marriage nationwide. Now, again, you can see that ruling encompasses a kind of a broader range than a lot of others, including the one in North Carolina had, and it still could be referred to the full court on a different angle, and it could also be sent up to the Supreme Court, just not yet. So here we are, moral issues in front of the court. It's nothing new, Robert. I mean, this is something that we've watched really almost since the creation of the court. But here we are again, where understanding of sexuality and what it means in this society and what should and should not be permitted, again, is faced by 9 men and women in robes.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, the Supreme Court, our court system is based on rule of law. And so we're obviously, I mean, it was apparent from the beginning that there was going to be pushback on these things, because it brings into conflict two of our most important rights as citizens of this country. And it's the right to express ourselves freely. That's the right of free speech, and the right to practice our religion as we see fit in the marketplace.
Free expression.
Free expression. These are chiseled in stone in our Constitution. Now, you know, you get into the weeds when you start trying to draw that line, that bright line, saying that, well, when your expression, your freedom to express what you believe infringes or impinges on the rights of someone else, then there are limits on this. And so we have, over the decades, centuries, have clarified most of these things.
Right.
But with these last decisions coming out of the courts, that's all been thrown in chaos now. So we're going to have to fight this thing out in the courts. So, it's going to. I wouldn't be surprised if this one in Mississippi goes to the Supreme Court.
Oh, I think it will.
Yeah, it's going to get there. You know, and the one for the Civil Rights Commission in Colorado basically determined against the Masterpiece Cake Shop and changed the entire way they do business.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
they basically, that commission said, you can no longer do business the way you wish to do it. And you're going to have to retrain, you're going to have to change your policies, you're going to have to go through all of this stuff. And so, yeah, this is serious stuff.
And the Masterpiece Cake Shop, I think part of their argument is that they're not just a cake shop, that he's a cake artist, that he should be free to express his art.
That's exactly right.
As he wishes it to be for a patron that he chooses to serve. So it's a little bit different from just going down to the bakery and ordering
pulling one off the shelf,
right, and saying, "Will you put this on it?"
Right. Yeah, no doubt. And it's the same with the florists. It's the same with the photographers. It's the same. That is an art form. These are art forms.
Yeah.
And so, as an artist, Carl, do you have the right to determine your art, what your art will represent, or what you will express through your art?
If it's in a commercial venue.
Well, it's funny that you should mention that because years ago I worked for a sign company, and we made a lot of banners and things. And there was a certain president in office who was coming into Raleigh, and somebody came. I did not care for that president. I did not care for that president's policies at all. And somebody came into the sign shop and said, we would like to make this humongous banner that can be seen from the air, that as the president flies into Raleigh-Durham Airport, they'll see this big greeting, welcome President so-and-so, we love you. Okay. And my boss came in and said, we're going to do this. And I said, I'm not going to do it. I cannot in good conscience do that. And he said, do you want to keep your job? And I said, yes. And he said, then you will do this. Okay. But that was different because I wasn't the owner of the business.
Correct.
Okay.
You're an employee.
But he was the owner. Mm-hmm. And I felt like and his politics were the same as mine. And I was actually surprised that he agreed to do this. But what it came down to was a question of money. They were willing to pay a lot of money for this, and he wanted to get the business. He wanted to get the exposure. I understand all of that. Okay, but in the case of this cake shop, this was never about money. I think the only money that it was about was when these guys went in there and said, "Okay, we want to get this cake." Well, I don't feel right doing that. Well, then we're going to make sure that we destroy you. And we're going to get some money out of this in the long run.
Well, but you bring up a point as being an employee there, where your rights may have been abrogated by your employment.
Right. Right. But this guy here was the owner of the shop. The buck stops with him.
Yeah, but part of the argument though is that he's not the only shop in town.
That's right. So. And these people could have gone to another sign company.
He didn't want them to. The owner didn't.
No, the owner didn't want them to. Okay.
Right. He would have lost
this
the
guy,
business.
I think if I was the owner of a company, and this is an old argument. How many times has this been argued over the last couple of years? If I'm the owner of a business and I choose not to accept a particular job, I should have that right. I should have that right. Especially, I think, if it infringes upon my religious beliefs. The thing with the sign company, those were my political beliefs.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, see, again, this is a part of the argument here is that this is a civil right that you're violating, or that the cake shop owner is violating, or somebody else who might be under this law in Mississippi. Is it similar to racial discrimination? That you don't have a right to say, if you open up a store, you don't have the right to say that you're not going to serve black customers. For example, if you're a white guy, you don't have a right to say that.
Right.
So how is it that you have a right? Is that religious? Does your religious conviction, override any civil understanding or of order in the law?
Yeah, and this is where we do constrain free speech rights. We do constrain religion in some circumstances. I mean, we just use that illustration. I mean, if a mixed race couple comes to me and wants to be married, or be served in my restaurant or whatever, do I have the right? Well, I mean, constitutionally, I'm not sure about that. But morally, do I have the right? Do I have the right to experience the consequences of my decision to not serve someone or whatever? I mean, this is where this is what's going to have to be determined in the courts. And it's really tough to pin this down. But if I'm a baker like Phillips, this gentleman, and he says, no, I'm not going to do it, well, he has the right to do that, but there may be consequences to making that decision. And they could be legal consequences or they could be social consequences. I mean, they could boycott his store.
Right.
I mean, legally, that's freedom of expression.
But the question is, should he be forced to do it?
Should he be forced to do it?
You mentioned
That's right.
about a mixed race couple coming to you and asking to be married. If they were members of your church, if they were part in there, you'd be hard pressed to say no.
Absolutely.
And I can't imagine a moral reason why you would.
Exactly.
But this is this is eventually where this is going to go. Is there an obligation for someone to provide a service that they would provide to some people under certain conditions, now to provide it to anyone?
Yeah.
So that's going to be that's really ends up being the crux of where the Supreme Court case is going to go, and Neil Gorsuch could be the deciding vote. We'll see how that goes. We'll have more to come on Faith Matters in a moment. And welcome back to Faith Matters here on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. In this, our final segment, which we have kind of finally become known as the Sign of the Apocalypse segment, is that we have a story that actually originates in Washington State and in Cullowhee, North Carolina. And it's an article that's in the New York Times and came out. This is actually an older article, but it deals with a Washington State group that is about to realize this as well. So I don't know if we're going to fit all that in, but it's a project to turn corpses into compost. And maybe we could have saved it for Halloween, but this is again is a couple of years old in its origin, but in Washington State it became more of a factor through Washington State University. And a Washington State University person had led this effort to use cadavers. This article here from Cullowhee, it says the body of tiny 78-year-old woman, gray-haired, falling over stiffened shoulders, was brought to the hillside at Western Carolina University, still clad in blue hospital gown and chartreuse socks. She was laid on a bed of wood chips, and more were heaped atop of her. If all goes as hoped, the body will turn into compost. It is a startling next step in a natural burial movement, even as more people opt for interment in simple shrouds or biodegradable caskets. Urban cemeteries continue to fill up. So it becomes an environmentally conscious way. I don't even know if I can't read it anymore. Robert,
I have to admit, we have been into gardening for a long time, and organic gardening, Josie and I, and so this has been we used to teach this stuff years ago, back in our hippie days and all of that. And one of my jokes back then was, I don't want to be buried, I want to be composted. And so to be reading this article and having to comment on this, that they are seriously developing a strategy for compost. It just raises so many red flags. I don't even know where to begin. But the idea is that once you're composted, then you would fit a 3-foot cube. You would produce about 3 feet deep, 3 feet.
Keep going.
Yeah, and that would be the amount of compost you'd get from that, and which is basically the size of your average compost pile when you're a little home gardener, that builds the little cubicles, where you move the compost there. That's kind of what you would yield. I don't know. This is so despicable. And deplorable to even think about it.
Well, just this week. Now, this is an older article, but this week, one that came out in the Moscow Pullman Washington Daily News from Washington State, it says Washington State University is acquiring the necessary approvals to test equipment to compost human remains at one of its facilities in what is bluntly being called the Urban Death Project. Founded by Seattle-based designer Katrina Spade, the Urban Death Project is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to create an ecological alternative for the care of the deceased by returning their bodies to the earth through the process she calls recomposition. Lynn Carpenter Boggs, Associate Professor, WSU Department of Crop and Science and Soil Sciences, says that the project team is an exciting yet boring phase of seeking necessary approvals to conduct this research on the Washington State campus. So this began back in Cullowhee back a few years ago, now being realized, perhaps same people involved, in Washington State University. Carl, is this going to replace the columbarium at a church, and we're going to have the garden now? Is this going to be the grandma and grandpa garden?
We can pray that it won't, Ben.
Yeah.
And I think I'm already praying that it won't. As pastors, we help, or at least I hope that we can help people as they live. And part of our job, too, is to help them die well. And the whole funeral industry, while being a, multi-million-dollar industry, it serves a very great purpose because it gives people some closure. And death is an ugly thing. And the whole funeral process can take some of that sting of the ugliness away. Okay, this takes that all out of the picture. I mean, it really does. Now, does this put a realistic spin on what happens when we die? Sure, it does. We rot. Okay, that's what happens. Dust to ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But in a sense, I think it also devalues the human body and the essence of a person.
This is on that continuum that we've talked about earlier in the show. Even we talked about the devaluation of life. Correct. And even in death, we're devaluating. We're making it an economic decision or an ecological decision here, and not one that honors the service of death and resurrection.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the church, we do have a theology of the body. It's real. The sacredness of life. And that this even though this is our frame has been a corrupted and become a temporary frame, in the original creation of it was not. It was an eternal being. Right. And through sin, it has become corrupted, and death has entered into this process. And so we really, you can see how the abandonment of good theology can lead to this kind of thinking, because then you just have you have a commodity that, this is a commercialization.
Which we're seeing in the abortion industry.
Well, absolutely. The fetal tissue, the whole part of that, the buying and selling of fetal parts. And so now this is just that continuation of that thinking. Ideas have consequences, and they lead to this kind of atrocity. Really, to me, this is.
Well, and look at the tradition of the Judeo-Christian movement. Okay, you go back into the Old Testament. What did they do when somebody died? They placed them in a tomb. Okay, you look at the time of Jesus. What did they do when Jesus died? They placed him in a tomb. Look at the story of Lazarus. They understood what happened when you put someone in a tomb. They began to decay. But there was a certain respect for the human body, that when a person died, it was proper. It was proper to place them into a tomb.
Yeah, and even they knew that the decay would lead to just a little bit left of bones that they put in an ossuary box.
Right.
So,
right.
But it's not. It's different from, this is where we're going to plant the vegetables next summer.
That's right. And it also gives the family some closure. too. The whole funeral and everything, that gives everybody some closure. But here they're talking about building a building where you carry the body up a ramp and drop it into a hole at the top, and they just keep compressing down and compressing down. And
the movie Soylent Green.
Well, exactly. That was the first thing that popped in my mind, too. And the other part, well, even the Native Americans understood the sacredness of the body. Mm-hmm. And they would build, they had a completely different worldview than we do, but we understand why we don't do this in the Christian church or even get near this is because we understand that in the end of time, there is the complete redemption of all creation, including our bodies. It gets all redeemed. Right now, it's just the spiritual redemption. But eventually, it's going to be creation, and we are part of creation. And so, you don't mess around with this stuff. I mean, look, people are buried at sea. People are, cremated. I mean, there are lots of different things.
There's many other ways that people do return to the earth. I mean, in one fashion or another.
Exactly. But you don't set up a commercial enterprise for this to accomplish this.
Because again, what's the next step in this devaluation in this is creating energy. You could do that. I mean, that's what compost heap does. It creates energy.
Exactly.
So you could make that an alternative energy project.
Yeah.
I mean, is that where we're going?
Yeah, we're getting ready to plant the garden next spring. So, we'd love to have you be a part of that.
Well, I'm going to
better boy to Billy Bob tomatoes.
Look, when I come to your house, I'm going to pass on the salad. Okay?
Exactly.
Well, but it is something that we know that in this process of life and death, that death is but a part of the process of eternal life.
Correct.
It is this step along that way. All of that is treated with respect and honor, and to kind of just toss this away to be the mulch for next year, it just seems just a complete dishonoring of that whole process.
We call it abomination.
And on that note, we'll end here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.